Yeah, that sounded like a moderate level of excitement going on in the room there. It's good to be here after I wasn't here last week. So I was away. I was up in Sydney. Had the joys of getting up at 5 o'clock in the morning to get to the airport to get on a plane with a 15-month-old. So it was the joys of traveling with infants and stuff like that. But I was up in Sydney last week, so I couldn't be here and worshipping and seeing everyone. And part of the reason I was up there is one of my mates was getting married. So we went up for his wedding, and it was one of those weddings that was just once in a lifetime type thing. He was getting married last week, and they decided to have their wedding at the Sydney Opera House. So we're in the Sydney Opera House for the wedding, followed by a ferry ride around the Sydney Harbour, private ferry, to end up for the reception venue in one of the top 5 reception venues of Sydney. It was a once-in-a-lifetime experience that me and Megs headed up there for. And I was sitting there, and this one question was sitting with me. It's like, how does someone end up in a position where they can have a wedding at the Opera House? Like, do they just fall into that, or is it like hard work that they've put themselves to? Like, how is it that there's people who just end up in that space, that's even an option? I don't know about you, how you find yourself, but I'm not one of those people where things just fall in my lap, where I get opportunities like that. I'm one of those people who have to work really hard at what I do to try to get through. I'm not that person who like goes and tries to play sport and it just comes naturally to them, or whatever they put their hands to, it just works out. What's it like for you? Are you one of the people that things just come naturally like that? Or are you a bit like me that have to work hard at the things that we do? I was reflecting on this and came across the famous quote, Malcolm Gladwell. He says that mastery in something's not born, it's created, practiced, and educated. They say it takes about 20 hours to learn a new skill. So in a bit of maths, if you spend 45-minute sessions, that means you can kind of learn a new skill in about a month if you're someone that needs to work at it. If you spend 100 hours working on something, then you probably end up more competent in that than 95% of a population if you dedicate 100 hours. So again, maths, not off the top of my head. That's if you spend 1 hour a day, you'll achieve that in 3 months. If you spend 5 hours a day, you achieve it in 3 weeks, or 5 hours each day on your weekends, it's about 10 weeks. Gladwell goes on to say if you spend 10,000 hours, then you master a craft better than 1% of the entire population. That being said, can you imagine what it would be like to spend hours of dedication at something, to put all this time and effort into it and see no improvement, see no change, no impact? I think that would be crazy. I don't know about you, because I think as people, we're wired and created to grow. God's created us in such a way that we grow, that we change. Have you ever tried to master a skill? Have you ever tried to grow or learn something new? I drive a manual car. Right? I've always driven a manual car. One of my mates got a brand new manual van. He's not a manual car driver, and he's like, this van is hard to drive. I'll tell you what, if you can get in it and drive to pick up dinner without stalling, I'll pay for dinner. Right? I don't know if you ever jumped into a manual car that you've never driven before. You got to get the bite point. I was a little bit nervous. Got in, drove there without stalling. Because I've driven a manual car for like 20 years. Now, he gets into his car and goes, oh, yeah, it's pretty hard. And he tried to leave and stalled straight away and ended up paying for dinner that night. I've tried to learn a few different things. I've taught myself to kick left-footed for soccer. It took me about 3 weeks to learn to do that, of dedicating because I injured my right leg. Learning trade skills, learning a new skill. Trying to teach myself Karen, speak Karen. And I tell you what, I've got a lot of work to go to get up that 100 hours. But try and learn something. Have you ever tried to learn a skill? Have you ever tried to learn something or teach yourself something? Maybe you want to just mention what you've tried to teach yourself to the person next to you. Take a moment now. Share. What have you tried to learn, or what's something that you've mastered in your life? I can see that we've all mastered the art of communication this morning. That's good. It would be easy for me, as I was thinking about this, it would be easy for me to get up here this morning and to say that we need to be living lives where we need to be growing, not just in skills or competency and abilities. As I start to reflect on this talk, I start to write a sermon about how we're all meant to be growing in every aspect of our lives. I'm going to share that sermon tonight, but as I sat and reflected on that, I reflected on the fact that I've been following Jesus for 20 years. I came to know Jesus 20 years ago. There's a lot of people in this room who have followed Jesus for longer than that. I'm 35 years old. There's people in this room who have been following Jesus for longer than I've been alive. Many of you who are sitting here already know that it's normative, that Jesus brings transformation and growth in our life. You've experienced it. You've shared stories about it. You have wisdom and insight from this growth that you've been on in your life that you've shared with others and seen it impact them. If I'm honest this morning, as I sat here and reflected, at 35 years old, one of the deepest longings in my own life is to hear and to sit under some of the wisdom that's held by you guys in this room. Your experience of how Jesus has grown you and has transformed you. Because I want to grow. I want to continue to grow. I know that growth is a good thing. I'm sure we do know that as a community, yeah? Growth is normal. See it every day. We see it around us every day. Living with a 15-month-old, you see it every day. Zadie, my daughter, has been growing incredibly over the last few months. I think I've shared before, but she loves animals, and she loves animal sounds. So you go, hey, Zadie, what does an elephant say? And she'll be like, brrr. Or what does a lion say? And she goes, rah. And she's just learning animals. She's probably up to about 20 or so animals now that she just mimics the sounds of. Just this week, she started with a stacking tower, and you could say the colors, like get the blue one, and she'll put the blue one on first, and then get green and yellow and orange, and she'll stack it in the right order. She's learning her colors. She's just started jumping and wants to jump everywhere. So we were at a cafe yesterday. She's walking up to people saying hello and then starts trying to jump up and down the corridors. But when we're in Sydney, I want to play a video for you. When we're in Sydney, she discovered her shadow for the first time. And I managed to capture it on camera. And I'll get the guys to play this for us.
Shake you. Ready?
It's cute, right? This isn't just a parent being, oh, my child's cute. It's cute, right? I think growth is a good thing. It's an exciting thing that we get to share in. But we don't just grow as people and grow in skills and abilities. We grow in our faith. We see it with Peter in the Bible, where we can read through the Gospels and there's so many stories where he puts his foot in it and then God grows him through it. We can see him like sinking in the waves when he's walking on water, to preaching boldly in Acts chapter 2 to the crowds. We can see that he denies Jesus and then he's running to the tomb to see him raised from the dead. He's no longer there, and then standing courageous and declaring who he is, who Jesus is in the courts. See him move from being a fisherman to the leader of a movement. There's so much growth. We see it with Paul, who thought he knew God, was pursuing God, thought he was doing God's will, And then Jesus intervenes and changes the trajectory of his life. We see him go to the disciples, and the disciples are scared of him because he used to kill Christians, and he spends 3 years in the desert, 3 years in Arabia, growing and being transformed before he steps into the mission that Jesus calls him to. Our faith is described as a seed because the seed grows. It's planted, gets watered and nurtured, and it grows and it bears fruit. Growth as part of our faith is expected to be a normative experience. It's something that we should be witnessing and seeing. But as I said, a lot of you guys know this. You've walked lives of it, spent years with Jesus. So the question I want us to consider today is the question of, do we arrive? Are we ever fully grown that we've got no more room to grow? Have we reached a point, or do we reach a point where there's no more growth required? So this morning, I just want to share a little bit. I want to speak to two groups of us this morning. Firstly, I want to talk to my peers on behalf of the coming up generations of our younger people in our community. I want to encourage you to just translate some of the things that we talk about this morning and ask yourself, what would it look like to walk alongside a younger person in this crazy world of competing opinions and challenges that they face in following Jesus? Because primarily this morning, I want to talk to the generation who's older than me. Because on behalf of myself and my peers, for those maybe 10 years either side of myself, we're looking for someone to look up to model the way forward, to invest or to invest again. And I think the best way to do that is for you guys to keep running the race that Jesus has had you on. And run it well, not just for yourself or for your peers, but run it in a way that invests in the younger generation who's looking forward and striving to follow Jesus as you guys have done. We want to know the stories and to be inspired in our faith by how Jesus has grown and is growing you guys. Because we need you. We want to know the stories of your walk with Jesus. We want to know the lessons that have been learned, the experiences of the valleys and the mountaintops, the comfort of knowing that it will be okay, that God can carry us through. We need to hear the stories of growth and transformation of the past and how God is still working and growing in your lives today. And this morning, to share some of the powers of these stories, for all of us, I want to just look at a couple of things in the life of Moses. A couple of stories that have been recorded and written down that encourage and inspire our faith. So who's Moses? For those that haven't been around church circles or may not know, if you have been around Christian or Jewish circles, you would know him as this great character of faith, this great hero of faith that not only is held in religious circles, but Hollywood has even grabbed hold of and popularized. It's a big champion of faith. But to give a brief snapshot of who he is, this is some of his background. In the Bible, we see this narrative beginning with the Israelites being in slavery in Egypt. They've multiplied to the point that the Egyptians became scared and concerned that they could overthrow them. The Jewish people, the Hebrew people, could rise up and overthrow them. So Pharaoh, the ruler, issued a decree for all the male children to be thrown into the Nile and killed. Moses' mother was trying to protect him, so she created a basket, a raft, and hid him in the reeds. Sometime later, Pharaoh's daughter was down there, and she discovered the basket and raised him up out of it. And as his life goes on, Moses is raised in Pharaoh's palace. So here we have someone who's got a degree of privilege and accessibility to things that others don't have. He's educated, he has luxuries, he's a very different upbringing to that of the other Hebrew children. Yet all the while, he'd also know that he was an outsider. He's not like the Egyptians. He is a Hebrew. He would have looked different. He had a different pull on his heart and his life. And he had the reality of watching what was happening to his people around him while he was in this palace. Moses is one of those few characters that we have a long expanded narrative. So we get to see what God is doing across his life, how he's using him, how he's growing him, and how he's challenging him in different seasons. The first point that we want to pick up this morning becomes nestled in the early stages of Moses' life. Moses has reached this point where he sees an Egyptian slave driver beating one of his fellow countrymen, another Hebrew person. And Moses responds. He jumps into action and he kills the slave driver, buries him in the sand, hides him in the sand, but word gets out. And Moses ends up fleeing all the way out to the desert and staying or dwelling by a well. It's here that some women came to draw some water, and they started to get bullied by some of the local shepherds who were there. And Moses, once again, jumps up and springs into action and protects them. Except something's different this time. He does so without killing someone. Now, I don't know about you, but I would say that's a significant amount of personal growth right there. To go from killing someone to not killing someone. Now, for us sitting here, that might seem a little bit extreme. I don't know all of your testimonies, but I'm going to speculate that the majority of people in the room, this isn't part of your story. But we can often think, the first thing we can often think when it comes to seeing growth and transformation is that we're being changed. There's a habit or a behavior that God is changing in our lives. Our old nature is being transformed into a new nature. We're a new creation. The old pattern of living or the old way of seeing the world is being changed. I'm sure for us in this room, many of us do have a story where something like that does happen. Where our lives have been changed or a behavior has been broken, or we see the world and live in a new way. For those who were here about a month ago, we had Catherine come and share. And she shared her story about her steps and walks of being an anxious perfectionist. I know for many of us here, that story was both encouraging and powerful as God used it to speak to people who were in similar situations, or those who needed encouragement to face what they were facing, even though it wasn't the same thing. The stories of transformation are powerful when we share them, when we hear what our God does in our lives. So again, I'll ask, how has God encouraged and grown you? What story is he working in your life? What's he setting you free from? Because it's important to remember these. Some of these experiences or these stories need to be shared. Because honestly, these stories of what God has done, how he's grown you, might be the encouragement or the truth that someone's waiting to hear for God to grow them. We need to hear them because they push us deeper in our faith to trust a God that can work in such a way. Or to give us the perspective to continue to face the season that we're in because God is greater. These experiences that you have had means that God may have taught you things or given you answers or perspectives that my generation hasn't even faced that question yet. We need to know that our God is bigger. Now, when we read the story of Moses, he goes and sits by this well. And at the time when the text is written, that imagery of sitting by a well, it's synonymous with being at a place of meeting or an encounter with God, a place where God provides, a place of nourishment that comes from him. And as we sit with God, he does deep work in our lives to chip away at things that need refinement to make us more like Jesus. It also is the place of communal meeting and gathering. It's where people come together and life exchange happens. That's why there were shepherds there. That's why the women were there. It's a place that people come to. So maybe today, as we come to this place and gather together. God's bringing someone to your heart or tugging a little bit about how he can use an experience that you're faced with him to encourage or support someone else in their journey of life and faith. I can recall for myself a conversation I had with a member of this community here who had been involved in ministry and work, and they were a lot more mature than I am. I can remember clearly meeting with them, sitting at this cafe. And it wasn't the greatest coffee, and for those that know me know that I like good coffee. It wasn't the greatest coffee. It wasn't this most profound mountaintop high spiritual encounter, but it was profound in my life. So what they did was just share a story of their life, their journey of faith. And through it spoke radical challenge to me about how I approached both my faith and ministry, how I prioritized my family and not sacrifice them in the name of ministry, how to not let your identity become enmeshed with the role that God's called you to in this season, or to how to embrace the day that God has given you and to seek first what he's wanting you to do today for his kingdom and glory. What he did was share his story, and it challenged and grew me in my faith. What story do you have that can be shared to encourage and grow someone else? What's God worked or is working in your life that could build up someone else? Because I think as a community, we're longing to hear those stories. Because as we hear them, they grow our trust in God's call and purpose. And the second story that we see from Moses' life, we see his growth to be able to hear God's call and then respond to it. For Moses' life, most of this is covered between Exodus and Deuteronomy, and you see this happen again and again. But this morning, I just want to reference two notable examples. The first one comes at the start of Moses' journey in responding to God, where he calls him to be a leader, to lead his people out of Egypt. And when this experience happens, Moses initially wasn't sure that it was the right thing for him to do. He had his doubts. But through this experience, God proved to him that he was in control, and he was also provided the help that Moses needed to fulfill this call. Now, many of you in this room today have experienced similar moments in your life where God has spoken or called you or provided for your needs. It might be the provision of funding at a time when you needed it. It might be the provision of something like a job or a car that came at just the right time. The person who calls you up, or you might have called someone up, and it was the conversation that needed to happen. That shows that God's in control and he cares. I'm sure there's countless testimonies of experiences of how God has called and used you and provided, how he can make tough roads and experiences, and he can use those for your good. When I was a teenager, I remember a senior gentleman in our congregation sharing this story about how he had this big business. All his retirement was settled. God had blessed him abundantly, and then overnight, like that, the whole company burnt to the ground physically, and he lost everything. Didn't have insurance, lost everything that he had. And in that moment, he said to his wife, he goes, "This is a really hard season that we're in, but we need to trust in God and not lose faith in him, because he will take care of us and he'll provide a way through." He concluded this story by saying in the next 2 years, by being faithful, for him at least in his story, God blessed them immensely, regrew the business, and had over doubled it in its size, restoring and growing that which had been lost. Now, this is significant for me because I reached a point where our bank accounts were really low. We were struggling to pay our mortgage and pay our bills. And I said to Megan, I think we need to be wise in this season with what we're doing, but we shouldn't lose heart and we need to trust God. because he can provide. And I remembered this story that I heard when I was a teenager. A few weeks after saying this to Megan, we had an unexplainable moment where money appeared in one of our accounts that was not there earlier, and it was enough to pay all of our bills, cover our mortgage, and restore our savings account. I've got no idea where it came from. But God reminded me of this story about remaining faithful to him, and that was the posture we took. God grows us in our trust to his call and that he provides when we hear and share and experience these stories. Moses continued to experience this later on, again when he was in the wilderness and they needed food and there was nothing around. He goes, it's going to be okay because I know that God provides. He'll provide if we trust in him, that he'll meet their needs for that day. And it grew the people's faith. The experiences that we have in our journeys with Jesus can be a testimony that someone needs to hear to expand and grow their faith for what they're facing today. It might be to trust God into the unknown. It might be a story that reveals part of the character of God that someone needs to hear so they've got something to hang on to. But the longer we walk with Jesus and grow closer to him, the more stories that we should be building up and the more stories that we should have to be able to share. And if I'm really honest, I love hearing these stories. I love these testimonies as we share them together about how God's been faithful in people's lives and how he's been carrying them through the years. We praise and we rejoice what God has done in people's lives 5 years, 20 years, 30 years ago. We also want to hear what God has done this year, in the last 6 months, the last week, how he's continuing to do that. I want to hear the stories about how God isn't finished yet, because this builds excitement and hope of how God is going to continue to work throughout all of our lives. It isn't just someone in their 30s that God works through, that he's faithful across all of life. So what is God working in your life today? How is he moving? How are you continuing to grow, and how are you sharing and celebrating those stories with those around you? Because God has called us to growth. The final story that I'd like to reflect on this morning as we prepare to finish up comes from the end of Moses' life. One of the last things that we hear about Moses is that he's on the edge of the promised land. He's done the hard yards. He's led well. He no longer has the strength of his younger years. It's his time now to hand the reins over to the next generation to carry the work forward. Now, this story has a lot of debate around it, why Moses couldn't enter the promised land, and some of the larger narrative around it. On the simplest level, there's part of it that's due to a consequence of a decision that he made earlier in his life. But I want to share one other perspective today with you. One way that this is explained is that Moses has reached the edge of the promised land, but there's no need now for him to enter. He's reached a point in his walk with God that there's nothing left to prove. There's no mountain left to climb. No opportunity that he needs to chase to get some sort of validation for who he is. His identity is no longer built upon his role or his position or his influence. Ultimately, there was nothing that the promised land could have given him that he had not already arrived with God in. He didn't need to enter to find fulfillment, but he was at this point of peace, rest, and contentment of sitting with his God. I know some of the people in this building, for those that don't know, that aren't aware, there's people in this building that have held significant positions of influence, big business leaders, we've got ex-pastors, great missionaries, head of organizations, both Christian and non-Christian. There's people who have been faithful for years in serving in organizations, serving their families, and they've done the hard yards. And really, compared to people who have walked this road for the coming up generation, we're just cutting our teeth into it, right? There's this beautiful image that I want to share this morning of a nomadic tribe that talk about how the tribe operates and how everyone's got a role to play. I heard this story years ago, this image, and it stuck with me. It starts with the little children who bring joy and run around and play in the middle of the tribe. Everything's an adventure. Everything's new. They're learning and growing. And as they grow, they reach this age where they're old enough to begin to contribute to the village life. They help to learn to cook, to mend things. They help out where they can. They continue to grow and learn skills. And as they reach adulthood, they begin to take on some responsibility for the tribe. They hunt for food. They help those in need. They carry the weight and the load for those in the whole village. Some of these people grow to be the key leaders who look at the direction. We're going to move in this direction now. They lead the way. But they also come along behind some of these leaders to make sure that no one's left behind. They go out in front and they forge the path so people know where they've got to walk. They watch the edges to make sure no one wanders off. They care for those who are around. They hold the tribe together. And right in the center of this tribe are the sages, those with the life experience. And they sit at the center of the tribe. And they've got a fundamental role to play because their role is to encourage the heart of the community, to remind the next generation about what is most important, to help teach the young. They may not be able to contribute and lead like they once had, but their role is even more important now, for they hold the wisdom that they're now entrusted to pass on and to raise up. I think today in our society, there's a longing for the people who are prepared to sit and to hold the heart, to speak the words that bring life, to notice what's happening and to encourage, and to pass on the wisdom that they've learnt over the years. And I wonder this morning if maybe there's some people in this room that might be ready to step into that place. They're prepared to take on this most noble position, to hold the heart, to speak the life that many of us are longing to hear, to pass on the treasure of a life that has walked with Jesus and is even now still growing and being transformed to be more like him. We don't have to be the one to forge the way into the promised land or to chase the next thing, but content in God and want to spur the next generation on and help them grow into who God is shaping and calling them to be. As a father of a little beautiful girl, it gives me so much joy to watch Zadie grow. To fumble her way through, she doesn't have to get it right. She doesn't have to make the perfect run for me to be proud or draw the most beautiful picture for me to be championing her along. The joy comes in watching her grow. And I think the same is true of God as our Father, who smiles and loves as he watches each of us grow, whether we're 1 year old, 10 years old, 50 or 100. He's still smiling and walks with us and watches us grow as our behaviors and habits shift and change, as we trust to follow his call, but ultimately as well to be able to sit and be content and at rest in him. Our walk isn't over until the day he calls us home. Until then, there's growth and transformation for all of us. There's a role for each of us to play in encouraging, championing, empowering, sharing, and walking alongside each other, walking alongside the next generations. So as we finish today, I want to finish with a question, and it's for all of us. I want to ask the question, is there anyone here that would like to join us on this journey of being transformed and growing? Because in this room sits a whole bunch of wisdom and experiences that are invaluable to following God and growing deeper in him. Let's pray together. Father, I want to thank you that you're a God that invites us to participate with you. You're a God that's at work, that's moving, that rolls up your sleeves and jumps into our lives and wants to see us grow to be more like you. I want to give you praise this morning for the work that you have done, the testimonies that you've written in this room in people's hearts and lives. I pray for each of us that we can grow to be more like you, that we would have the courage to follow you where you lead, but also the courage to share those stories, to inspire and to spur one another on. Father, may you be the one that we're chasing. May you be the one who's at work. And may you be leading and guiding and transforming us so when people see us, they see you. We give you praise this morning. In Jesus' precious name.